So, hello everybody. This is the Authority Podcast presented by Minority Authority, the brand. My name is Darnell. I'm a little late. My apologies. Um, for this podcast topic, I wanted to talk about the Civil War. And basically, what I did with the Civil War topic is that I came to about 5 different points that I read about in terms of the Civil War that I didn't know previously. And so I just wanted to kind of just speak about them on this. If you've been following any of my podcasts, first off, thank you. But the idea behind my podcast is to really, just kind of educate the Black community about some of the things about us, or just to give us some knowledge to be able to empower ourselves. If we got knowledge about ourselves, we can conquer the world. If we got knowledge about the world, we can conquer the world and more. So if you got knowledge about yourself as well as the world, then you can be unstoppable. And that's what my goal is with this. That's what my goal is in general in life, in terms of what I do is just to continue to learn. Not to do it because I'm trying to impress anybody, but to do it because I want to be a learned person. I want to be able to know and understand more about the world. And whatever I do know or understand about the world, I want to be able to empower other people with it. So the Civil War topic, one of the things that really interested me about the Civil War was that I guess I personally didn't really understand the divisions that there were in between the poor and the rich Southern people. Whenever there's war in terms of like in world history period, whenever there's been a war has mostly been fought over 2 things. War has either been fought over ideological dominance. In most cases, it's like religion, or it's been as a result of money of some sort. If you're cutting in on somebody's profit, if you're cutting in on, just on somebody's money, somebody's land, that is usually grounds for war. Or if you're just trying to take over somebody else's stuff, you want to strong arm somebody. That is usually grounds for war. And that's exactly what's happening in Russia right now in Ukraine. Russia just basically wants to take over Ukraine. And that's pretty much why they are fighting. If you ask me about the Civil War and you ask me what it was fought for, I would tell you a little bit of both of them. There's a little bit of ideological dominance, basically white supremacy. And it was about finances. Cotton was king in the South. Cotton was the biggest economy in the South. And also in the North. I know the North kind of gets a pass, which I'll discuss a little later in this discussion. But the North had a hand in it also. The cotton that was yielded in the South was transported north, where it would be exported from New York. So I got a little interesting story about that too, which I'll share with you a little later. So basically, the Civil War was described as the rich man's war, but the poor man's fight. And I'm gonna give y'all some points that I took away from some of the things that I learned about it. So let me go through my notes and I will read them for you. So for one, there was a 20 slave rule that gave exemptions to planters who owned 20 or more slaves. Some other exemptions included like teachers and ministers and politicians and stuff like that. Now, when I talk about the rich-poor division, that has always been a thing in terms of war, too. Usually when a country goes to war, it's usually over rich people of some sort, because you're usually cutting in on their shit. But usually a lot of poor people go to war. Interesting thing about that is the 20 slave exemption rule. Those were usually the people who had the money and they were able to get out of fighting the war. But those were the people that the war was mostly fought over. Trump, for instance, the last president, y'all know who Trump is, was able to get a military exemption for, I think they said that he had foot spurs. So basically, because Trump had money, he was able to get a doctor to basically sign some paperwork saying that he had foot spurs and he didn't have to go to war as a result of that. Nearly 1 in 8 Southern soldiers deserted. The official count was about 103,400 people out of a total of about 750 to 850 troops. A lot of Southerners, they basically understood that there wasn't really much to gain, at least financially, from fighting the war. So the South had a big problem with that. Another thing that I discovered about the Civil War was that the Confederacy, the South, had a lot of food shortages. And they have food shortages because the well-to-do people, the people who had the slaves, they didn't want to donate any of their land to plant food for the soldiers that were fighting for the rich people. They wanted to continue to plant cotton to be able to yield while the war was going on. So they just refused to do it. And as a result of that, the Southern or the Confederate suffered. The soldiers from the Confederacy suffered. Also, another thing with that is that the rich people also stashed or they hoarded a lot of the rations that they had. And so that was another thing that kind of hurt the South. So aside from them wanting to plant the food, they didn't plant any food for the soldiers. And also whatever food that they did have down there, they basically hoarded it. So it was basically business as usual for the rich people of the South. The second thing that I wanted to talk about is that during the war, Lincoln made several concessions to the South, pleading that he would pay for every slave that was set free by the South, basically. So on April 16th, 1862, Congress passed the District of Columbia Compensated Emancipation Act, they basically mandated fair market value for enslaved belongings to the residents of the nation's capital. So if you are geographical, you know that D.C. sits in between Virginia and Maryland. And at the time, Virginia was a slave state and Maryland was a free state. So any slaves that were in that area, if they were, if the slave owners wanted to turn their slaves over, Lincoln would basically pay them for whatever slaves that they turned over to be free. And Lincoln ultimately signed an act that resulted in the freeing of about 3,185 persons at a cost of about $1 million. So that's about $313 per person. Now, I got that stat from a book that I read. It's called From Here to Equality, and it's about reparations for blacks. And so what they did in that book was they basically calculated everything. They calculated a whole bunch of stuff. I touched on it before. But anyway, I got that stat from that book. So Lincoln paid about $1 million in 1860s money for about, like I said, it was about 3,100 slaves, and the amount per slave broke down to about $313 in 1860s money. Now, because the book is about reparations, they basically calculated how much that would be in 2019 money. And how they calculated that was they put about a 4% interest for every year from 1860 up until 2019 on the $313 amount that was originally paid. That amount in 2019 would total about $141,500 that those slave owners were paid for each of those slaves. And as I was saying, he did it at a 4% interest rate yearly. Now, if you know anything, especially with all the stuff that's going on now, you know that the interest rate is a lot higher than it has been. But inflation on a yearly basis is anywhere from 2 to 4%. So that dollar amount that was calculated is fairly accurate, I believe. Number 3. During the war, Lincoln appointed a person to attempt to facilitate the exportation of black peoples. I touch on it a little bit more, but let me read off of what I was saying. Abraham Lincoln in 1861 asked his Secretary of the Interior to research a plan to colonize black people on the western coast of what is currently Panama. By 1862, as the Union struggled, he began to worry that he would lose support for emancipation, a necessary war strategy if he did not pair it with a colonization scheme. In August of 1862, Lincoln invited 5 black leaders to the White House to meet with him in a newly appointed position titled Commissioner of Immigration. So he appointed a new guy as Commissioner of Immigration with the idea of deporting newly freed slaves if the North had won the war. And he wanted to discuss a colonization plan. So Lincoln basically informed the leaders that Congress had appropriated about $600,000 to ship black people once they were freed to another country, basically. And that is also From Here to Equality, the book that I got it from, the book that I was just discussing a few minutes ago. So the $600,000, I don't know. That's a small amount in terms of at the height of slavery. So right up until like 1860, there were about 4 million black people in America. In order for Lincoln to get people on board with him freeing slaves, he had to tell the people that, hey, once we free them, we want them to move to a different country, or we want them out of here. And I think that was the only way for him to be able to get people on board with even fighting the war to begin with. I don't know if that was his plan. I don't know. I don't know what his plan was, but he probably did want to ship us to wanted to ship black people to another country. But the $600,000, which I didn't even do a calculation for how much that would be today, is a small amount in comparison to what he paid, slave owners to free their slaves. So that was something that kind of jarred me, that kind of shocked me a little bit about the Civil War. When I was probably in like high school, because I'm a history guy, I like reading about history. I just like history in general. A lot of the people that I would talk to about history, or even in college, was like, slavery was a thing, or the Civil War was about taxation. A lot of people would tell you in a roundabout, and it was mostly white people, but a lot of people would tell you in a roundabout way that it was about everything but slavery. But when you look at how much money was involved with the trade of slavery, there could have been no other option of what the war would have been about. So it's always, the more I be reading about stuff, the more, not the more questions that I have, but the more that I realize that I've been lied to. So as I was saying earlier, that's what my idea is behind this podcast, is just to give you information. And you don't necessarily have to take it from me verbatim, but it is a different side of the story to get you to look at things a little bit differently. And another thing is when I'm talking about just things about black people in general, or how white people look at things in terms of, the racial code here in America. It's a different perspective than what mainstream America is telling you. Because if mainstream America told you their version of the story, you would have a different narrative, which a lot of black people do have a different narrative because they don't read it from our perspective. And our perspective is important. And a lot of what we've been told, or a lot of the things that are true, are hidden from us. And so you have to open a book and you have to read about it. So that's why I'm here. And that's why I'm really, I just want to put it out into the atmosphere. And I really don't care how people feel about it. The fourth thing that I found out about, I didn't necessarily find this out about slavery, but I kind of knew it, but I want to elaborate on it a little bit. And I said something earlier about it. The North-South myth. The South gets a bad rep for slavery, and rightfully so. But the North does not. The North was believed to be more moral on the issue of slavery, and that is a falsehood. The North was not primarily abolitionists on moral grounds. They were anti-slavery because it would drive down wages in the North if slaves were freed. And the North was mostly industrial area of the United States at the time. So If slaves, let's say if slaves were, allowed to work in industrial areas and stuff like that, slaves would, you don't have to pay a slave to work in a factory. But, if an Irish or an Italian immigrant came over, they were coming over looking for work. So you had to pay them. So if slavery were to continue and you put slaves into factories, white people wouldn't have no jobs. And white people didn't want to go for that. But if they knew the slaves were freed, they probably would have to compete with them. But, they would just have to take lower wages instead of not getting paid at all. So that was one of the interesting things that I learned about, or that I kind of discovered about slavery and the Civil War. Another thing, a little side story that I tell y'all is Henry Lehman in 1844 immigrated from Germany. I'll tell you who he is in a minute, to Montgomery, Alabama, and opened a shop basically selling groceries and dry goods to area cotton farmers. He eventually created a cotton storage business with his two brothers and became the area's largest buyer and seller of cotton. He eventually moved this business to New York City and spearheaded the New York Cotton Exchange. More recently, the company was known as Lehman Brothers. And before the financial crash of 2008, that wiped the company out, Lehman had assets of about $680 billion. That's how deep slavery is in America. So Lehman Brothers, you would never know that, but basically got its money up from trading in cotton and slave labor. Slaves were sold on Wall Street as well. Yes, the financial hub of America. And also New York did not, they did not grow or harvest cotton, but they basically shipped it from New York ports. I had something in a book that I was reading. I couldn't find it while I was going through notes. I got a lot of notes that I store, and I just couldn't find it. And I would have cited it if I did have it, but whatever. But New York was, a lot of the cotton that was exported from America went out of the shipping ports in New York. And the last thing that I wanted to say about slavery, I do got two honorable mentions too, but I'll get to that in a minute. But the last thing that I wanted to say about slavery and as well as the Civil War was slaves being able to enlist in the North really helped out. Over 200,000 black soldiers fought and died in the Civil War, both slave and free. And as you can imagine, they were given subpar artillery and gear, and were paid last. Slaves or former slaves were not given equal pay until 3 years after the war had started, which they fought in during the time. Their pays were routinely late, and sometimes they weren't paid at all. Black Army privates, if paid, were given $10 a month. That works out to, I did the math on that, it works out to about $15,000 a year, $15,722 to be exact. And $3 to cover clothing. So $10 a month, and it broke down to about, they were given $3 to cover the cost of their clothing, and $7 was their net, basically their take home. White soldiers, on the other hand, same rank and all, were paid about $13 a month, and a clothing allotment of about $3.50 to bring their monthly pay to about $16.50. So the black soldiers were given $3 were taken out for their clothes. White soldiers were given $13, and they were given $3.50 for clothing and stuff. The white soldiers, their pay worked out to be about $25,500 annually. The total cost of the Civil War for the Union was estimated to be $6.1 billion, and about $2.1 billion for the Confederates. And I believe that's in 1860s money. Also, the amount is apart from any payment for slave portions, which is total to be about an additional $3 billion. And that's from Here to Equality also. So I took 3 quotes from the book From Here to Equality. I actually got the page number for that one, too. That one is, you can find that on page 101 in that book. I think that is it. So, an interesting thing or a little trivial information about the Civil War. Even today in America, there are what we would call Civil War reenactments going on all across the country. America still has a fascination with the Civil War. People do it for recreation or sport. And they basically get dressed up in, whatever kind of clothing they wore in that era. And they basically do reenactments. I think it was a movie that, I can't think of the movie. Janelle Monáe played in it. And it turns out that the movie was basically a reenactment of the Civil War. And it just speaks to the fascination that we have with, I don't know if it's a fascination with slavery. I don't know if it's a fascination with American history. But they do it for the Revolutionary War also, but they do it for the Civil War mostly is what I've seen. But, I don't get the fascination behind it. I'm a history person, but I still don't get the fascination behind it. We don't do Vietnam reenactments. We don't do Iraq War reenactments, Afghanistan. We don't do none of those kind of reenactments. Korean War, we don't do none of that. But it's about the Civil War and the Revolutionary War. I don't know if because I don't know if the reason is because those wars were fought here in America. But I don't know. So that is my time. I'm sorry I was a little rambling, with this one. I try to just give you some information. I did the format with this a little bit different because I put it in numbers and how I counted it. But if you've been following my podcast, thank you. I hope I gave you some kind of information. I am on Facebook, Minority Authority Brand. Instagram, Minority Authority Brand. I do have TikTok videos that I just put up like 2 TikTok videos. So I'm working on those also. I am a little busy, so just bear with me a little bit. And as you can see, I'm a new podcaster. So it's still hard getting used to talking in front of a camera. But I'm definitely with it. And I enjoy the growth process. So thank you for watching and y'all have a good day.